Welcome back to our study of the book of Revelation. This is session 11. We are rapidly drawn towards the end of our study of Revelation. You've probably noticed that over the previous sessions we've looked at two, perhaps three chapters each session. Today we must slow down. Today we really will just look at one chapter, Revelation chapter 20. Revelation chapter 20 is perhaps the most hotly debated chapter in the entire book and in the entire book of Revelation, and it is one of the more difficult chapters of the Bible to interpret. Here in Revelation chapter 20, we encounter the millennium, or the millennial reign. The origin of the term millennium comes from the Latin term milli, which means thousand. So when we encounter here the 1,000-year reign of Christ, hence the term millennium, the millennial reign of Christ. And the various positions on this millennium really have become almost a lens through which people interpret the rest of Revelation, or in some instances, a lens through which they interpret the rest of the Bible. In short, there are four different ways of reading Revelation chapter 20, or in particular the millennium. There are really four different ways of understanding the millennium, the millennial reign of Christ, this 1,000 years. Does Jesus return before the millennium, after the millennium, or is there not literally a millennium at all? Does he come back before the millennium, after the millennium, or is there not a millennium at all? So let's delve into these. First, there's premillennialism, and we probably should distinguish two different types of premillennialism. In the early church fathers, we find some who are premillennialists, and for them, they envision the millennium, the 1,000 years, as being literal and as being after the return of Christ. So human history continues. Jesus returns before the millennium. And then after the millennium, there is a general resurrection and the eternal state. So that is a view of some of the early church fathers. There's also another version of premillennialism that has been quite popular over the last 175 years or so. And this comes from the work of Charles Nelson Darby and is sometimes referred to as dispensationalism. And this is very popular in some Protestant circles in the U.S., particularly in the latter part of the 19th century and in the 20th century. And according to dispensationalism, the view taught by Darby, human history continues, but getting progressively worse and worse, until at some point in the future, Jesus will return secretly in an event known as the rapture. This will usher in 7 years of great tribulation, after which Jesus will return in glory, and then there will be a literal 1,000-year reign. If you see people on TV or on YouTube preaching about the millennium and they have complex charts and graphs behind them, that person is, almost certainly a dispensationalist coming from this dispensational, pre-tribulational, premillennial viewpoint. So that is premillennialism, and like I said, there are really two different versions of that. Now there's also postmillennialism, And it is the idea that the church will usher in a great period of peace and righteousness before Jesus returns. Postmillennialists normally assume that the millennium is symbolic. So postmillennialists normally assume that the millennium is symbolic rather than being a literal 1,000 years. Jesus reigns here and now in and through the work of the church. And this in part comes from a statement in the gospel that the gospel must be preached to all the world before Christ returns. This in general is an optimistic view of human history. So human history goes on. The work of the church will bring in a period of peace and righteousness, after which Jesus returns. And that period of peace and righteousness that the church brings in is, in essence, the millennium. This is, of course, a very optimistic view of human history. For the post-millennialist, the kingdom of God is primarily a present reality. For the premillennialist, the kingdom of God is primarily a future reality. So the premillennialist, the kingdom of God is primarily future. For the postmillennialist, the kingdom of God is primarily a present reality. There is also another view of the millennium, and it's called amillennialism. The prefix "a" is a negation. It's not quite accurate that they don't believe that there's a millennium, but rather the amillennialists would argue that the millennium roughly coincides with the church age. The church age begins, the millennium begins with the ministry of Jesus. In the ministry of Jesus, Satan is bound, and we read about that in the Gospels. Jesus describes binding the strong man. No one can plunder the strong man's house unless he first binds him. We read Jesus saying in the Synoptic Gospels, so we can see the exorcisms as binding the strong man. We see the binding of Satan, the defeat of Satan at the cross and in the resurrection. And so Satan is bound then in the ministry of Jesus, particularly the exorcisms, the defeat of Satan in the resurrection. And since then has been the millennium. Revelation chapter 20, John sees an angel descend from heaven with a great chain to bind the devil, that ancient serpent which is called Satan. So the millennium begins with the binding of Satan, and the Synoptic Gospels can be read as saying that Satan is bound in and through the work of Jesus, particularly the exorcisms and resurrection. So amillennialism is, of course, similar to postmillennialism, but is a little different. Amillennialists aren't as optimistic about the future. For most amillennialists, human history will continue pretty much as is. Some might see the time right before the end being a little bit worse, but human history will continue pretty much as is. The kingdom of the church sometimes making advances for the kingdom, other times suffering loss for the kingdom, until at some point in the future, Jesus returns in glory, at which there is a general resurrection. So for the amillennialists, the kingdom of God is both a present reality and a future hope, a future reality. With this issue of the millennium, it is very important to recognize that no matter which view of the millennium you may take, you can find good scriptural warrant for it. But if you examine these closely, you can also find issues and problems with each of the three. One last thing to consider, and I've referred to this before. How do we use this term thousand? How is the term thousand used in the Bible? Most of the time it is used symbolically. Most of the time we encounter the term thousand in the Bible, it is being used symbolically. 1,000 years is as a day, a cattle on 1,000 hills, showing mercy to 1,000 generations. So we have these views of the millennium. Two different types of premillennialism, postmillennialism, amillennialism. It can be very confusing for certain. What do you think? I hope you enjoy your discussion.